Thank you guys for giving me this opportunity to present and preach. Oh, sound. Sorry. Better? All right. Okay. Thank you for the opportunity. Grateful to be here. The family's grateful to be here. We've been here 6 months now, and looking at the weather is actually fun. It's not just hot or not. It's rain, wind, storm, whatever. It's been awesome. All right. Fear in God. Have you guys ever been afraid? Maybe. it's pretty common, right? There's an idea out there that humans are born with fear. It just there's nothing you can do about it, and we're gonna go through that and talk about that. But just so you guys are aware, growing up, I was a very fearful kid. Everything scared me. It led me down a path of trying to understand fear as best as I could, and this is the presentation that is a culmination of all of that. Let's see here. Nope. Okay. No problem. All right. So does anybody know what the number one fear in America is? Actually, the world. Any ideas? Scorpions. No. Ironically, that photo or that silhouette is of an emperor scorpion. That's the most common thing you see in the media when they talk about scorpions. It's actually quite harmless. It's big. It looks scary. But if you look at its claws, they're abnormally large because it grabs its prey. It does have a stinger. It does have a little bit of venom that'll paralyze its prey. But to humans, it's just like a bee sting, sometimes less. The true scorpion to be afraid of is in Arizona. It's called the bark scorpion. It's really tiny, brown, it hides. And there's just, it's scary because you don't see them. They'll climb your walls, they'll fall off the roof on you and stuff like that. It can be pretty bad. But no, the number one fear is public speaking. So anybody who's ever been up here, you guys are heroes. It's not easy, but that is the number one fear in the world is public speaking. It beat death, beat harm. It's people would rather die than come up here and present. As we go through this, we're going to cover a couple of things here. Where fear is coming from, where the source of it is. There's different categories of fear. There's flavors of fear. You may not have known that. And then fear of God. That will wrap it up. All right, first let's define fear. Let's level set and make sure we're all kind of on the same page here. Fear is an unpleasant feeling, emotion caused by the belief that something or someone is dangerous, likely to cause pain or threat. It comes straight from the dictionary. A little note here, we're not going to cover phobias. That could be a clinical thing, a medical condition. Some people do develop phobias. Just because you're afraid doesn't mean it'll turn into a phobia. It can. Some people just have phobias. They're just, for whatever reason, their brain or whatever just has an irrational fear of something, and it does require professional help. So what I cover here is not intended to cover that category. I am nowhere near qualified enough to talk about that. So we're not going to go there. We'll mention a few things here about phobias, but in general, a phobia is something much, much worse. But fear, what we'll be covering is what you guys fear or feel typically, right? Whether you're driving and you're almost in an accident or something happens, that is the fear we'll be covering. Now, like I mentioned earlier, there are scientists, and you probably heard these things, that there are about 2 or 3 fears that all humans are born with. One of them is a fear of heights. Another one is a fear of loud sound. And another one is a fear of insects, particularly spiders for some reason. I don't know why. I like spiders. Not enough to handle them or anything. My brother will. But they say that we're all born with that since we're children. So here's one experiment, 1960. It was called the Visual Cliff Experiment. It is available online if you want to go look it up. They did an experiment where they took a bunch of children under, I think it was a year and a half, 18 months. And they built 2 platforms. And in between the platform, they had this clear plexiglass. And the idea was they were going to have one of the child stand on one platform and the parent on the other platform. They were to call their child, and they wanted to see if the child would perceive the height and go or not, right? People use this study to cite, see, children were afraid to cross, even though it was their mother or their father calling them. Therefore, we are born with a fear of heights. But if you go through the study, the conclusion says we could not confirm that children are born with this fear, because in their results, with the 20 kids that they did more, they did several of these, but on average, the result was about 5 to 10% would not cross. Whether they were afraid or not, they couldn't tell. There were all sorts of reasons why they say they didn't cross. About 50% of the kids didn't care. They just crossed, they just went right across it. And their parents called them. Some of them would go in the middle and just play there. They thought they were floating and they were having fun. And a few would not cross, but when they switched the parent, then they would cross. Sometimes they would cross if the person conducting the experiment was calling them, but they wouldn't go to their parents. The results were all over the place, right? So the reality is that we are not born with a fear of heights. The study couldn't prove it, and they even wrote it's unlikely that we're born with this height, and it's very difficult to prove. But given their results, they're like, we're not going to say that we're born this way, right? So that kind of defunks that idea that we're born with the fear of heights. But then it comes to the itsy bitsy spiders. So I mentioned the other fear that we're supposed to have. Let me take a breath. Is that we're afraid of spiders. I gotta say, there was a really cool spider that took residence in our porch. It was brown and hairy, but when it moved its joints, it was bright orange. I thought it was the coolest thing. And I wanted to catch it, but at the same time, I didn't want to disturb it. And after 2 days, it moved away. I don't know why, but I thought it was the coolest thing. But anyway, anybody here afraid of spiders? Got a few? I know my wife, if there's a spider, I'm the exterminator, right? I got to go get that spider. Well, in 2017, they ran a study because they wanted to prove that we're born with this fear. And it was a simple study, same thing. They took a bunch of kids and they showed them 2 images, one of a spider, one of a fish or a flower, whatever. And after running the experiment, they too could not conclude that the children were afraid. As a matter of fact, they believed that at least in boys, when they saw a spider, they were getting excited. They thought it was cool as opposed to a fear thing. Sometimes kids would get scared when they saw fish or a flower instead of the spider. So it was just all over the board, right? And again, you can look it up. You can go read it for yourself. And again, it's just showing we're not born with the fear of spiders or insects. So if you have that, you weren't born with it, that's the good news. And then we'll talk about how we can work through that, right? The last fear is that fear of loud sounds. I could not find a study on this. It's just an idea, and it's very simple. If you've ever had a baby or been around a baby, the parents always say, don't scare the baby, it's sleeping, you're gonna startle it. And if you do make a loud noise, babies, not all, but a lot of them will cry or they'll act like they're startled, right? It seems like it's a fear response. But if you think about it, if you ever dump cold water on someone who's not paying attention, the reaction is actually the same. And this is probably more for the guys. How many times have you been startled and you say, I wasn't scared, and everyone just laughs around you and they don't believe you because they saw your response? You're right, you weren't scared, but your reaction seemed like you were scared, and people assume that loud sounds, especially in children, is an inherent thing that you're born with. But there's no studies that can prove this. Actually, no studies have been done on this. And in general, the thought in the scientific community is that it's not that you have a fear, it's that whatever state you were in has been changed suddenly, and then you're reacting to that versus being afraid, right? So the question that I've been posing here is, well, where does fear come from? If you're not born with it, where in the world is it coming from? And the answer is back in the text that we read. A little hard to read there. For God has not given us a spirit of fear. I underlined that part right there to highlight the emphasis. If you think about it, if God didn't give us the spirit of fear, I believe it's talking about creation, meaning when we were created, we were not given a spirit of fear. It was not put into us. So if God didn't give us the spirit of fear, your fear comes from yourself. It's a learned thing. whatever experiences you've had and whatever things that have hurt you, harmed you, or put you in a state that made you uncomfortable or unhappy, you've accepted it and told yourself, this is something I need to worry about or fear. And most of your fears are learned, right? How many parents here, those that have children, have taught their children fear? Put the fear of God. That's not a bad one. You have, right? You tell them to stay away from fire or hot things, or stay away from strangers and all sorts of things. You're teaching them fear. So that's the first source of it, is your parents have taught you to fear things. And as you get older, you take that idea and whatever you experience, you start making a collection of fears. And that's what it is. It's just a bunch of collection of fears, right? So when I came up here, when I committed to doing this, all week I was afraid of doing it, right? And I'm like, this is ironic. I'm not supposed to. But the idea that you guys may not like it, or it might not be funny, or it may not work out, is just overwhelming at times. And I just had to push it away and power through it. And I've done enough of presentations and I've preached a few times that I can manage it, right? So it doesn't debilitate me or anything like that. But I would encourage anybody who's afraid of coming up here or presenting or doing anything like that, just power through it. For whatever reason, you've accepted the fear that public speaking, at least, is a horrible thing. And I'll be honest, it can be. I've done some presentations that were pretty poorly received, and it wasn't fun. I had to sneak out of the church because I was like, oh man, this is really bad. Well, it wasn't that bad, but I felt it was that bad, right? And it can be scary. But I'm still doing it. I'm still up here, and hopefully, I've already know my exit, so if something happens, I know how to get out of here. All right, now, there are categories of fear, right? You've probably heard most of these. That third one is probably the most common one you'll hear. You got fear of harm. You've also probably heard of a fear of death. The idea is just getting hurt, dying, anything like that, right? Then there's fear of separation. This is more about being lonely, isolated, rejected. This is where public speaking fear comes from. The fact that, one, you've isolated yourself because you're up here, and two, if it's not accepted or well received, then you're going to be ostracized. So that's what it means. And then finally, the fear of the unknown. This is the most common one you'll hear everywhere. And when you don't know something, you can be afraid. And I mean, how many here have ever been at night in the dark and you hear something and you get scared, right? Just because you don't know what's out there. And what do we do to protect ourselves? The almighty blanket, right? You go underneath it, and that will protect you from anything out there. That's how you solve your problem. I do have a note out there. There's a guy, Dr. Carl Albrecht. He broke out the fears into 5 categories, essentially kind of like what I did there with fear of harm and death. He has 2 categories. He did the same thing with separation. But if you look at it, harm is your physical fears. Separation is your emotional fears. And then the unknown is your intellectual fears. It's what you don't know, don't understand. So how do we deal with these? Well, that text we read at the beginning also has the answer. He didn't put us that spirit, but a spirit of power, that's your physical fears, of love, that's your emotional fears, and a sound mind, right? I was blown away, guys, when I was studying on fear and trying to figure it out for my own, that this verse perfectly encapsulated all the fears that we're going to have. It just fit perfectly. And I thought it was amazing. I'm like, well, I shouldn't fear anything. I still have fears. I mean, I can't get rid of them, some of them. Some of them I've been able to go through them. But the good news is God gives us answers for every single fear that you have, right? You're not alone. Now, your flavors of fear. Now, I used to say black licorice, but I didn't want to offend anyone if someone happened to like black licorice. But I looked it up. Apparently, that's the most hated flavor in the world is black licorice. Most people are not a fan. I don't mind it, but whatever. So I just put dirt. So hopefully you guys don't like dirt to eat. So chocolate, I like chocolate, so that's why it's there, right? So that's my favorite, one of my favorite flavors out there. But essentially what I'm trying to say here is fear. There's good fear and bad fear. And this is true with all your emotions. God gave us emotions. They're not to be ignored, but we're not to let them control us or take over, right? So the way you start figuring that out is, well, what's good and what's bad? And we're just going to focus on fear today, obviously. But we're going to cover what a good fear is and what a bad fear is, and the results and the intent of each fear. So as you start processing your fears, and this really was helpful to me, when I identified a bad fear, it was really easy. Oh, well, I'm not going to be afraid anymore because that's not helping me in any way. But the good fear is like, okay, I need to hold on to this, right? I mentioned earlier, as parents, we teach our children to fear things. That's good fear. We're trying to keep them alive. We're trying to keep them safe. And our kids, because they have no fear, because they're not born with it, that's why they do these crazy things. They're not worried about it. They trust the parents and they know, well, if I get myself in trouble, mommy and daddy are going to be there to help me and save me. So it's ironic how we as parents sometimes can get frustrated. Why are you not afraid? I got to teach you this. And it's because you've done a great job. And that's why they're not afraid. And that's why they do crazy things. All right. Go back to the Bible here, 2 Samuel 28. I'm not going to read everything here. I'm going to assume most people have heard this story. This is about Saul near the end of his career, basically. God had, in a sense, rejected him. He hadn't rejected him outright, but he was no longer responding every time he'd go to the temple and ask for guidance. So in desperation, he's about to go to battle. He needs confirmation from God if it's going to be a good battle or not. But because God's not responding, he starts looking for a witch and finds one. And this is the message that supposed spirit of Samuel, and I got to clarify that because it can get confusing when you read it through and you don't pay attention. It almost seems like Samuel really was there and gave him this message. The message goes, so why do you ask me, seeing the Lord has departed from you and has become your enemy? And the Lord has done for himself, he spoke by me. For the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hands and given it to your neighbor David. So already the message is telling them, you're losing your stuff. You're losing what you're proud of. That's the fear of separation, right? And the message continues to go on. Moreover, the Lord will deliver Israel with you into the hand of the Philistines. And tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. The Lord will also deliver the army of Israel into the hand of the Philistines. So now it's the fear of harm. You're going to die. Your children are going to die. And you're going to lose the battle, right? Now, for those that know the story, that's kind of what happened. And a lot of people read this and they're kind of like, well, did God use, God could use anyone. Did he use the spirit of Samuel to go? No, did not. And the key is in the message itself. All the fear that's put into Saul is designed to redirect them away from God, to not seek God's protection, his forgiveness, and salvation. And when you watch and when you read the rest of the story, this did not come true. There's one detail that didn't come true. Saul was not killed. He committed suicide. When he heard that his children had died, he remembered the message and thought, there's no hope. Why continue? So he killed himself. And ladies and gentlemen, suicide is one of the ways you commit the unpardonable sin. Because once you kill yourself, you can't ask for forgiveness for killing yourself. So you're done. So the devil got him, gave him a message, drew him away, put him in isolation, and killed him. That's what bad fear does. It draws you away from those that can help you. It keeps you away from God. It keeps you away from doing the right thing. So keep that in mind. If you have any fear of doing something, saying something, whatever it is, and it's taking you away from God, you need to get rid of it. Just ignore it. God didn't give you that fear. You learned it for whatever reason. And obviously, I'm simplifying here. You probably got to dig deep, talk to people, figure things out. It's not that easy. But it's there. And the good news is you're not powerless. God gave you the spirit of power. It can be dealt with. Now, an example of a good fear, Genesis 2:16 and 17. And the Lord commanded the man, you are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. For when you eat from it, you will certainly die. This is Jesus speaking to Adam and Eve. And this is the first instant in the Bible where fear is used. Prior to that, you don't hear anything about that. It's all about creation and bringing, and it's all happy. So very early on, God teaches his Adam and Eve fear, right? So it's valid. Now, what is the message designed to do? What's that? Obedience. Yeah. Keep them alive. Keep them safe. Keep them close to God, right? Because if they die, they're not with God anymore. So all three fears are encapsulated here. You're going to get hurt. You're going to be alone, and you don't know what death is. So good luck, right? Did they pay attention? No. But after sinning, Adam was pretty strong in the Lord. He learned his lesson. And that was a fear that he held on until he died, right? And that's what good fear does. It brings you back to Christ. Just like parents teach their children to not do certain things or touch certain things, it's to keep them safe, to keep them alive so you can be with them and they can learn from you and grow and become functioning members of society. So there's your different flavors of fear, good and bad. Make sense so far? All right. Judas and Peter. I want to talk a little bit about the results of fear, when it's good or bad. You all know how it ended with Judas. He committed suicide, right? When he realized what he had done, he returned the money to the priests and threw that money. And they're like, that's your problem. What's it to us? We don't care anymore. And Ellen White notes that they reacted that way because he did it publicly. And it became very obvious that they had bribed someone to betray someone, to betray Jesus, which was unlawful when you brought people to court to be judged, right? So to kind of push themselves away, it's like, it's not our problem, do whatever you want. Now, this isn't in the Bible, but Ellen White points out that when he was rejected from the priests, because he's looking for some sort of redemption, a form of redemption, I should say, he turned to Jesus, who was there, and it's like, hey, I'm sorry. And God's like, this is what I'm here for, right? And he took that as rejection. He was so afraid that God no longer loved him or wanted him. And not even that. He was more afraid that his plans didn't work out. It was selfish, right? And that bad fear came in and it's like, see, you messed up. And it drove him crazy that he walked off and he committed suicide. That's what fear does. Bad fear, right? You look at Peter. Peter almost did the exact same thing. He betrayed Jesus as well. And if you look at what Jesus teaches us about murder, he says just calling someone empty-headed or insulting them, that's murder. So when he's rejecting Jesus, he's telling the world, not only do I know this guy, he's not who he says he is. He's done nothing to change me, right? I don't know him. He murdered Jesus by rejecting him in a way. And his response, when he saw Jesus, when he made that eye contact and he realized what he had done, he ran off, went to Gethsemane, got on his knees, and begged for forgiveness. He cried his soul out. Ellen White tells us that he experienced what she calls a true conversion, right? That fear of what he had done to God brought him back to him, didn't push him away. So that's what good fear does. It can literally save your life. So you're going to hear out there in the world, fear is bad. You should be fearless. And that's not true. Fear is a guide rail. It's intended to keep you safe. It keeps you from doing dumb things, especially from past mistakes. You learn what not to do. So not all fear is bad. It's a tough story about Judas, but it was a process. It wasn't like at the last moment he made a mistake and then committed suicide. He was taking steps to get there. So that's a bit of a comforting thought for those of you that think, well, maybe I'm on a path. That's the fear telling you, you're on a bad path. Come back to God. Come back to wherever it is you need to be to make it right with the Lord. All right, I'm going to be a little interactive here. I've been reading a lot of the text here. So we're going to open up our Bibles, Isaiah 41:10. And this is there's hundreds of verses about fear in the Bible, right? So I'm just going to focus on a few here, but I want to equip you when you're dealing with these fears. At least you can know and read these verses to help you power through or work through whatever it is you're struggling with. So when it comes to fear of harm or death, let's look at Isaiah 41:10. This is a very common and popular verse. Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. Yes, I will uphold you with my righteous hand. Right? This is how some of our martyrs were able to stand at the very end when they're being literally murdered. They're claiming this promise, like God's strengthening them. If you ever read a book called, what is it, Fox Book of Martyrs, right? And it kind of details all these martyrs throughout history, starting from Stephen and on. There's usually a common thread there, or a common pattern there. When someone was right with the Lord and they're being tortured and murdered, they were quiet. They didn't cry out in pain, they didn't suffer, they didn't struggle. But when someone was not right with the Lord and they're being tortured for God's sake, they're screaming and kicking and fighting, and usually they recanted and accepted the idea that, okay, fine, God's not real, or whatever it is they wanted him to say, right? So we look at this verse, even in death, you're not going to struggle or suffer. And I know a big fear, especially for mothers, is in end times when we're told that we're going to be tortured, and the idea that our children are going to be taken and hurt to get us to change can be quite scary. But the good news is they're not going to suffer. They're not going to struggle, right? Or at least you won't, maybe. I don't know about the kids, right? But it's something to keep in mind. All right, next verse. Fear of separation, Matthew 10. I did try to mix these up and not stick to Proverbs and Psalms. That's where most of your fear texts are. But Matthew 10, 29, 31. So whenever you feel lonely or like you're being rejected or whatever, here's what Jesus says. Are not two sparrows sold for a copper coin? And not one of them falls to the ground apart from your Father's will. But the very hairs of your head are numbered. Do not fear, therefore, you are of more value than many sparrows. I mean, if God cares about the sparrows, you've heard this. This isn't anything new, right? But when you're feeling alone or whatever, just know God could come down and tell you how many hairs you got on your head. Some more than others, right? All right. Fear of the unknown. We don't spend a lot of time talking about intellectual fears in the church. I mean, we do to a certain extent, but I don't feel we do it enough. I feel that a lot of fears are intellectual, and it's misunderstanding of scriptures and things like that, and we come up with all sorts of bad ideas. But this verse kind of starts pointing you where to start in dealing with some of those fears. 2 Timothy 3:16. And I knew I should have marked it. All right. 3:16. All scripture is given by inspiration of God, and it is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, and instruction in righteousness. Right? So when you're afraid, when you don't understand something, believe it or not, it could be about science, it could be about work, it could be about gardening, it could be about anything. You start in the Bible. I'm not saying the Bible is going to tell you when to plant your seeds or when to go out and ask for a promotion, but it gives you the basis to build off of. And from there, you let the Holy Spirit lead you and guide you to find out what else you need to research to learn about. So you can start working through that fear. But it starts in the Bible, right? All right, hopefully this has been helpful so far, because we're about to make it about Jesus, which is what all sermons, in my opinion, should be about, Jesus, right? What does Jesus have to do with fear? Are we supposed to be afraid of Jesus? No? That was a trick question. That's right. We are supposed to fear Jesus. So, Matthew 10:28. And do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul, but rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. This is Jesus talking. And he's telling this to the people around him. He's saying, you should be afraid of me, because I can destroy everything. And if you think about it, right? Can God hurt us? Yes. Can God isolate us? Yes. Can we ever understand him? No. He fits every single category of fear out there. That's who God is. And I know it's weird, and I always struggled with when I read the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. But I'm not supposed to fear. He didn't give me a spirit of fear. So why am I supposed to fear the person who created me? Well, because he created you. He can also destroy you, right? But again, good fear and bad fear. There's a good fear that we can have of God. Incidentally, a lot of times when you hear sermons on fear, they describe fear as, oh, it's a form of respect, right? It's how we respect our Lord God. It's not actual fear, it's just respect. It's just another way they say it. Ladies and gentlemen, that's not true. It's true fear, right? Here's what the Seventh-day Adventist Bible commentary says about fear. A proper fear of God in believing his threatenings works the peaceable fruits of righteousness by causing the trembling soul to flee to Jesus. Many ought to have this spirit today and turn to the Lord with humble contrition, for the Lord has not given so many terrible threatenings, pronounced so severe judgments in his word simply to have them recorded, but he means what he says. Right? We're supposed to be afraid of God. The good fear, right? It's the fear that brings us to him. Because if you don't fear God, why would you ever go to him? You'll figure it out on your own. He can't help me. He can't do anything for me. What he says doesn't mean anything. I see people who sin and they're thriving, right? I see people who are good Christians or supposedly good Christians, and look at all the trouble they're going through, right? That's how the devil gets you, using a bad fear to isolate you. Anything to just get you off that path, away from Christ. That's all he wants. He doesn't necessarily need you to commit suicide. If he can just put you on a path that's slightly askew, that's enough for him. Because over time, that becomes a wide gap. So it's a process. Right? Philippians 2:12, therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Right? Have you ever seen someone come to God and they're arrogant about it? They just walk in and are like, oh yeah, God's the best. Look, I got my Maserati, right? I got a beautiful house, beautiful wife. I love God. God's amazing. What do you want me to do to be saved? Sure, whatever. I'll do whatever. But there's no true conversion there. They're happy with what they have, and they're assuming that and it may be, it may not be, but they're focusing on the wrong thing. You have the example of the rich young ruler that came to Jesus, right? He was arrogant. He came up and said, God, what must I do to be saved? I'll keep the command. I've done this. This is a piece of cake. And look at my wealth, right? This is all a blessing from God. And God's like, well, only one thing remains. Sell all that you own and come and follow me. He couldn't do it, right? That's the arrogant spirit when you come to Christ. There's no fear there. He had no concern. He was looking for an accolade and confirmation that he was an incredible individual, and he wanted everybody to know it. That was not coming to Jesus, right? Work out your salvation with fear and trembling. So what are we supposed to fear? I want to leave it on a positive note because I know it gets a little dark there. Be afraid of God. He can hurt you, whatever. He can, but he doesn't want to. That's not his goal. Let's more think of it as a warning of what can happen. He wants you to fear him, but oh, fear the Lord, ye his saints, for there is no want to them that fear him. The fear of the Lord leads to life, and he who has it will abide in satisfaction. He will not be visited with evil. That's what God wants. He wants your fear. He wants you to have fear in him, but he wants you to have it because it will save you, it'll keep you, and it'll give you peace. It will prevent evil from occurring. Not that it won't happen. Bad things will still happen when you follow Christ, but they're all designed to help you grow in him, help you to become a better person, get closer to him. But at the end of the day, God loves you, he wants to keep you, and he wants you to live in peace and in happiness with him. Right? Thank you. Our closing hymn is going to be Faith in the Victory, hymn number 608.